My brother got married on a Saturday in October and I wasn't on the guest list. Not because we'd had some big falling out. Not because of anything dramatic or public. I just wasn't there. And when people asked him why, he told them I declined the invitation. That I said family events stressed me out. I never received an invitation. I found out about the wedding the way you find out about a lot of things in my family. Secondhand, through my aunt posting photos on Facebook. There was my brother in a navy suit grinning next to his new wife. My parents on either side of them beaming. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, all dressed up, all holding champagne flutes. I sat in my apartment in Columbus and stared at my phone for a long time. Here's what none of those people in those photos knew. I had been quietly paying my brother's rent for 3 years. Not all of it. At first, just part of it. Then somehow, all of it. I need to back up. My name is Vivian. I'm 31. I work in financial compliance for a mid-sized insurance company, which means I spend my days reviewing numbers and catching the kinds of mistakes, or not mistakes, that people hope no one will notice. I'm good at it. I like it. My brother used to call it the most boring job on earth, and I used to laugh and agree with him. His name is Kyle. He's 34. We were close growing up, or at least I thought we were. He was the kind of older brother who taught me how to ride a bike and let me sit with him and his friends during high school even when I was embarrassing. When he moved to Austin for a tech sales job at 26, I thought it was exciting for him. When I moved to Columbus 2 years later for my own career, we started doing these long phone calls on Sunday evenings, catching up on our weeks. I thought we were building the kind of adult sibling relationship I'd always wanted. Then the calls started being about money. It started small. His car had a problem. Could he borrow $300 until payday? Of course. Then his roommate moved out unexpectedly and he needed help covering rent for 1 month while he found someone new. Sure. Then the roommate's search took longer than expected. Then he got passed over for a promotion and was in a rough spot. Then his girlfriend at the time had a medical emergency and he helped cover her bills. I always said yes. He always said he'd pay me back. I kept a note in my phone, just a running tally. More out of habit than any real expectation. I'm good with numbers, I can't help it. By the time I'd been in Columbus for 18 months, he owed me a little over $11,000. I told myself it was fine. He was family. He was going through a hard stretch. I was doing okay, not rich, but stable, with a decent salary and low overhead because I'd been careful. I told myself the money didn't matter as much as the relationship. My mom knew some of it. I'd mentioned a few of the loans to her, not complaining, just mentioning. She said Kyle was sensitive about money, and I shouldn't make him feel bad. She said he'd always had a harder time than me, because things came easier to me. I didn't really know what that meant, but I filed it away. I kept saying yes. Here's the thing about gradual. You don't notice it happening until you're already in it. At some point, the calls stopped being catch-up calls and started being Ask Vivian calls. He'd spend the first 10 minutes asking about my life, and I'd notice myself waiting, knowing what was coming. Then it would come. And I'd say yes. By the end of year 2, he owed me closer to $24,000. I'd stopped counting out loud by then. The note in my phone had gotten so long I'd moved it to a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet. In Excel. With dates and amounts and little notes about what each one was for. I'd set it up one Sunday afternoon without really thinking about why. Just my compliance brain, doing what it does. He got engaged to a woman named Heather in the spring of my 3rd year in Columbus. I was genuinely happy for him. She seemed lovely on FaceTime, warm and funny, and I remember thinking that maybe this was the thing that would stabilize him. He'd been talking about getting serious about his finances, about finally paying me back in installments. I waited for a conversation about the installments. It didn't come. Instead, about 4 months after the engagement, I got a call from my mom. She was calling to tell me about the wedding plans, the venue, the guest list, the October date. She was excited. She mentioned that Kyle and Heather were planning something tasteful but beautiful, and that it would be a smaller wedding, close family, and close friends. I said that sounded wonderful. She didn't mention anything about me being on the list. I assumed that was because, of course, I was on the list. A few weeks later, I texted Kyle directly. Hey, wanted to ask about the wedding. Do you need anything from me? RSVP by a certain date? He said he'd get back to me. He didn't. I called him the following Sunday. He let it go to voicemail. He texted back later saying he'd been slammed at work and would call soon. He didn't. My mom called me in September. She was telling me about the rehearsal dinner arrangements, and at some point, something in her tone made me stop and ask directly, Mom, am I invited to the wedding? There was a pause. She said, Kyle felt like you two have had some tension lately, and he didn't want any stress at the event. I asked what tension she was referring to. She said Kyle had mentioned that I'd brought up the money situation in a way that made him uncomfortable. I thought about that for a second. The last time I had mentioned the money was 8 months earlier. Once, briefly, saying something like, I know things have been tight, but maybe we could figure out a plan for the repayment stuff at some point. That was it. One sentence. I said, so I'm not invited to my brother's wedding because I mentioned once that I'd like to be paid back the $24,000 he owes me. My mum said money had always been a sore subject for Kyle and I needed to understand his perspective. I said, okay, and I hung up. I want to be honest about what the next few weeks were like, because I don't want this to sound like I was calm and strategic from the beginning. I wasn't. I cried in my car in the parking garage at work. I called my best friend at midnight, and she stayed on the phone with me for 2 hours. I went through every version of the conversation I could have had with my mom, every different way I could have said it, every moment I maybe should have pushed harder earlier. I was angry. I was sad. I felt like an idiot. But here's the thing I kept coming back to. Kyle hadn't just excluded me. He'd told people I declined the invitation. He'd framed it as my choice. My mom, I learned later, had told my aunt the same thing. That Vivian had said family events were too stressful for her right now. He had taken my absence and turned it into a character flaw. That was the thing that shifted something in me. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I didn't send a long message laying everything out. I had spent 3 years being the person who kept things smooth, who didn't make it awkward, who absorbed the discomfort so everyone else could stay comfortable. I decided I was done doing that. The first thing I did was practical. I stopped the Venmo transfers. For the past year, I'd been sending him money through Venmo and sometimes Zelle when the amounts were under 1,000. I just stopped. No message, no explanation, just stopped. Then I waited. It took 11 days. He texted me, Hey, didn't see anything come through this month. Everything okay? I didn't respond. 3 days later, Viv, is there a problem? I still didn't respond. He called on a Wednesday evening. I let it go to voicemail. His message was casual, almost friendly, like he was checking in on an invoice from a vendor. Just wanted to make sure everything was good. Give me a call when you can. I didn't call. My mom called instead. Kyle had apparently told her that I was being distant and she was worried. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. She asked if something had happened. I said not recently. She asked what that meant. I said I was just focusing on some things and would be in touch soon. That conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. I know some people reading this are going to think I should have confronted him directly right then. Maybe. But I've spent a lot of my career learning that when you suspect something is wrong, you gather all your information first. You don't show your hand until you know exactly what you're holding. So I spent about 3 weeks doing something I probably should have done years earlier. I went through everything, every Venmo transaction, every Zelle transfer, every time I'd wired money from my checking account, every cash withdrawal I'd made specifically for him. And yes, there had been a few of those early on when he'd asked me not to leave a paper trail because his roommate's lease situation was complicated and he didn't want it to look like he had extra income. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I was very glad I'd kept the texts where he'd asked me to do it. I pulled a spreadsheet I'd been building for 3 years and I finished it. Added every source, cross-referenced against my bank statements which I'd downloaded from my online banking going back to when the transfers started. I organized it by date, by method, by stated purpose. I noted which ones he'd acknowledged in texts. There were several, where he'd written things like, This covers rent through the end of the month. Seriously, thank you. Or, You're saving my life, I'll get you back. I added a column for those acknowledgements. Screenshot, date, amount confirmed in writing. When I was done, the total was $31,400. I stared at that number for a while. Then I made a second tab in the spreadsheet with a simple amortization table, what a repayment schedule would look like at zero interest over 3 years. I wasn't trying to charge him interest. I just wanted to know what fair looked like. Then I printed everything, all of it, the transaction history, the text screenshots, the amortization table. I put it in a manila folder. I labeled it with a date. And then I waited a little longer. The wedding happened on October 14th. My aunt posted photos. My mum posted photos. Kyle and Heather posted photos. I looked at all of them, not in a masochistic way, just because I wanted to see clearly what I was dealing with. My whole family gathered, celebrating, and the story they'd all been told was that I'd chosen not to be there. 2 weeks after the wedding, I called my mum. I told her I wanted to have a conversation with her and my dad and Kyle together. I said it was important. She asked what it was about. I said I thought it was better discussed in person or at least on a video call altogether. She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't push. She set up a video call for the following Sunday. I spent the week before that call being very quiet. Not anxious exactly, more like focused. I did my job. I went to the gym. I cooked dinner. I read before bed. I felt, for the first time in a while, like I was in control of something. Sunday came. My parents' faces appeared on the screen first, side by side on the couch in their living room. Then Kyle joined from what looked like his and Heather's new apartment. I could see moving boxes in the background. He looked surprised to see me, like he'd expected my mom had set up a general family catch-up. I said, I appreciate everyone making time for this. I want to talk about the money I've lent Kyle over the past 3 years. My mom started to say something about not wanting this to become a thing. I said, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to share some information. I screen shared the spreadsheet. I walked through it calmly, in the same tone I use at work when I'm presenting findings to a compliance committee. Date, amount, method, purpose, confirmation. Date, amount, method, purpose, confirmation. I went through every significant entry. I didn't editorialize. I just read the numbers. $31,400 over 36 months. The call was very quiet by the time I finished. My dad, who had said nothing until that point, asked Kyle if these numbers were accurate. Kyle said the amounts might be a little off. I said I had corresponding bank statements for every single entry if he'd like to review them. He didn't say anything. My mom said she hadn't known it was that much. I said I understood. I told her I hadn't made a big deal of it at the time because he was my brother, and I wanted to help him. I said I hadn't brought it up because every time I got close to it, I was told to be sensitive about how he felt. My dad asked Kyle what he had to say. Kyle said the money situation had been complicated and that he'd always intended to pay me back and that he felt like I was ambushing him. I said, I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking for all of it at once. I put together a repayment schedule that I think is very fair. I switched to the second tab. 3 years, zero interest, roughly $870 a month. Kyle said he didn't know if he could do that. I said, I also want to address something else while we're all here. My mom said, Vivian. I said, I want to address the fact that I was not invited to Kyle's wedding, and that he told people I had declined an invitation I never received. The silence on that call was different from the spreadsheet silence, heavier. My dad looked at Kyle. Kyle said the wedding had been a stressful time and decisions were made, and he was sorry if I'd felt excluded. I said, I don't need an apology right now. I need you to correct the record with the family members who were told I declined. Specifically, mom's sister and anyone else who heard that version. He started to say something about how that was a lot to ask. My mom quietly said, Kyle, she's right. That was the moment. I hadn't expected her to say it. I'd prepared myself for her to smooth things over, to ask me to give him time, to remind me that he was going through a lot. Instead, she looked at him and said he's right. And then she looked at me and said she was sorry. I'm not going to pretend that fixed everything. It didn't. Kyle and I didn't become close again overnight, and the repayment situation is still being worked out. His first installment came in about 6 weeks after that call, and yes, I documented it. But something shifted in my family. My aunt called me the week after. She said Kyle had reached out to say there had been a miscommunication about the wedding and that I hadn't declined, there had been logistical issues. It wasn't a full admission, but it was something. My mom calls more now. Different calls than before. Not calls where she's managing the temperature between me and Kyle, but just calls to talk. She told me recently that she wished she had listened differently when I mentioned the money early on. She didn't say more than that, and I didn't push her. I think that's about as close as we're going to get. The thing I keep thinking about is the spreadsheet. Not in some triumphant way. I don't feel triumphant exactly. I feel tired and also a little relieved in the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. The spreadsheet didn't fix my family. It didn't give me back the October Saturday I spent alone in my apartment looking at Facebook photos. It didn't undo 3 years of saying yes when I should have said, let me think about it, or even just no. But it told the truth. Numbers do that. They don't get defensive or emotional or say you're being too sensitive. They just sit there and tell the truth. I don't think Kyle is a bad person. I think he learned over years that I would keep saying yes, and he kept asking. I was part of that pattern too. I let it go too long because I didn't want to be the one who made things uncomfortable. Here's what I know now: being quiet to keep the peace is not the same as peace. I was quiet for 3 years, and the whole time, a record was being built. Not because I was planning anything, just because I'm a person who tracks numbers and saves receipts and can't help documenting things. It turned out that was enough. If you're in something like this, if you're the person who always says yes, who keeps things smooth, who absorbs the discomfort, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Everyone's situation is different, and family is complicated in ways I can't fully understand for anyone but myself. But I will say this: keep the receipts. Not as a weapon, not because you're planning to use them, just because the truth has a way of being useful, and you deserve to have it on your side when you need it. I sat in my apartment on a Saturday in October. A year later, I know exactly what it cost me to be the person who said yes, and I know, down to the dollar, that I'm worth more than that. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long. Not the spreadsheet. That part makes sense. That's just how my brain works. I mean, why it took me so long to stop pretending that silence was the same as peace. Because for 3 years, that's what I told myself: that I was being the bigger person, that I was protecting the relationship, that if I just kept being patient and easy and generous, eventually things would even out. They didn't even out. They just kept going because I kept letting them. There's a version of this story where I'm the hero who had a plan all along. I really wasn't. I was just a person who tracked numbers and saved texts and happened to work in a field where documenting things is second nature. The spreadsheet wasn't a trap I set for Kyle, it was just what I do. And when everything finally came to a head, it turned out that 3 years of quiet documentation was the only thing I had that couldn't be argued with. That's the part that gets me when I think about cause and effect. Kyle made a choice every single time he asked, and I said yes. I made a choice every time I said yes instead of asking when. Neither of us made one big dramatic decision. We just made 100 small ones, over and over, until we'd built something neither of us probably intended. He built a habit of taking. I built a record of it. And eventually, those two things were going to be in the same room together. I don't think Kyle sat down and decided to use me. I think he figured out slowly that there were no real consequences to asking. And when there are no consequences, people don't usually stop. That's not a character judgment, it's just true. We all tend to keep doing what works until something changes. I was the thing that needed to change, and I didn't, not for a long time. What I've been sitting with since that video call is the question of integrity, not his, mine. Because the honest answer is that I compromised mine for years by saying yes when I meant no, by staying quiet when I had something to say, by absorbing someone else's dysfunction to keep a peace that wasn't actually peace. I thought I was being a good sister. I think I was actually just being afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of being the difficult one. Afraid of what it would mean about my family if I looked at it clearly. The spreadsheet forced me to look at it clearly. Every row was a date and an amount and a little note about what it was for. 36 months of choices all lined up in a grid. You can't be afraid of something you've already written down. I think what I want to say to anyone in something like this is just your patience is not the same as your worth. You can be generous and good and still require honesty in return. Keeping a record isn't cold or calculating, it's just knowing what's true. And knowing what's true is the only foundation anything real can be built on. Vivian didn't win because she outsmarted anyone. She won, if that's even the right word, because she stayed honest with herself when it would have been easier not to. That's the only move that actually matters in the long run.